Boker Tov, everybody. It's a pleasure to be learning Torah together. Today we're going to be learning a topic which is very important in the lifetimes of people. Thank you so much. In the lifetimes of people, and that is coffee on Shabbos. You know, coffee is not really a drink. Coffee is actually a religion. But luckily enough, coffee is a religion which is compatible to Judaism. So it is. So in lieu of that, it's important for us to appreciate how it was compatible, and specifically when it comes to Shabbos. And the steam is just ready right now. I want to take a moment to thank David and Irene Foyer, who are sponsoring this morning's shiur, as we note the upcoming yortzeit of David's father, Nachum Zev ben Shimon, who was a very unique person. He was actually a Ritchie boy. So he was involved in on this side of the Atlantic, fighting Germany, and ultimately also a paratrooper at Normandy as well, which is on D-Day. So a person whose sacrifice is one part of the reason why freedom is not free, as it says in the memorial down in DC. And Be'ezrat Hashem, Nishmos Ha'ed, he should continue nachas from his family, his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Be'ezrat Hashem for many, Langa Yaran. Be'ezrat Hashem for the rest of the mishpacha. So let us learn together. We have a lot to talk about when it comes to coffee on Shabbos. People say, the question usually goes, Rabbi, can I do this? You know, and the truth is that these types of questions have complexity to them, multiple layers. I'd like to go through some of those layers just to appreciate the complexity that's involved in some of these shilas, and as it applies to coffee. So this is where in the summer we're doing from the Shilah archive. We're going through to real shilas, and these are real shilas, but it's important to go through them in a sequential, in a logical fashion, one to one, from start to finish. So we're going to go in the following order for the following reason. Here's how we're going to start. We're going to start with something called instant coffee. And the reason why it's important to start with instant is we'll see in a few minutes why we have to go in this particular order. So let's start off with instant coffee. So we have our instant whatever we're talking about over here. This happens to be Nescafe Taster's Choice. This is a house blend, light to medium, as we can see over here. So we're going to start off with with instant. So what are the concerns? Let's just lay the groundwork for our concerns here. The first concern that we're going to have when it comes to instant coffee, and this is the most basic concern of coffee on Shabbos, is the notion of bishul. Are you cooking on Shabbos or not? And that's a very serious concern. So what is the halacha in this case? How does it work? Well, let's start at the beginning. So the first thing we should be aware of is that in order to cook, it needs to be the right context and the right temperature to cook. So that means to say, if you have something which is what's called a kli rishon, that's where cooking happens. So what is a kli rishon? A kli rishon is where the water is on the fire, where it is, even if it's no longer on the fire, as an example. So a hot pot on Shabbos, a kettle, a coffee machine itself, where the boiling is going on at the top, it's very hot at the top of this machine, that is all a kli rishon. So if I were to open up the top now, this is actually in the middle of boiling as we're speaking, but this just finished boiling. If I were to open the top and put something into there which is uncooked, that would be considered bishul midah, right? So I have cooked, or it is akin to my taking a pot on the stove and placing, a potato in it, an egg in it, and I'm cooking that. That is considered bishul. So that's a very serious concern, and that's we'll call the primary part of bishul. But now let's say that I'm no longer in my kli rishon. So let's say I'm taking my kli rishon and I'm pouring it into my kli sheni. So I've got my special cup, naturally. There's no implications on any presidential races, but nonetheless, so let's assume that a person is taking. Let's say one puts one's coffee into one's kli sheni. This is my second from the fire right now, and then I pour from my kli rishon into my kli sheni, as an example like this. So in that case, that would be what's called irui kli rishon, the pouring from a kli rishon. Pouring from a kli rishon is mevashel, what's called a kadei klippa. It's not a full cooking, but it will cook the outer layer of something which is raw. So if whatever I'm putting into my kli sheni is raw, then it'll be cooking, and a kadei klippa, when it comes to grain or granules, is cooking. So that's a problem. So that's also cooking like it would be if I put the coffee actually in the pot itself, right? What happens if it's the other way around? So let's say I pour all my water, my hot water, my boiling water into my kli sheni, and now I take my my coffee, and we haven't got to the status of coffee for a second yet, but let's assume it's raw. Let's assume coffee is raw for a second. and I put it into my kli sheni, what's the halacha of a kli sheni? Okay, so here's my kli rishon, here's my kli sheni. Now, technically speaking, somebody actually got this as a gift for us. It's a little jug which says kli sheni on it, right? Which is quite helpful because besides for being a very nice gift, what it means is you could do kli rishon, kli sheni, and then kli shlishi, right? So just to make things a little easier, and people are generally not drinking out of this. So if, let's say I have it in my kli sheni, what is the halachic status of a kli sheni? So the Gemara tells us that a kli sheni is not mevashel. A kli sheni does not cook. Okay, good. If that's the case, then it would be possible to put, even if it's boiling water, technically speaking, something into a kli sheni from a technical perspective. Let me just backtrack for a second. A kli rishon is only going to cook when it is at a particular temperature. Meaning, so this does not remain a kli rishon forever. It only remains a kli rishon when the water is at a certain bar, which is called yad soledes bar. What is yad soledes bar? Rav Moshe Feinstein puts it at lechumra at 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so that's not so hot. That's not so crazy hot. There are those who put it a little higher, 120, 125. But lechumra, once it sinks below 110, then you can use it because it's gone now into what we call luke territory. That's not cooking. It's not going to be able to do the full job of cooking, right? But let's assume that it's still boiling, and that's how I like to have my coffee. So I take my boiling water, I put it into my kli sheni. Okay, so I'm going to treat this as kli sheni from here on inwards. Okay, so I have my kli sheni. Can I put something which is not cooked into my kli sheni? So the answer is yes, technically speaking. Tosfos explains that because the dofnos makararos, which means to say that there's going to be a heat exchange between the hot water, which is coming from my kli rishon, and the cold walls of my kli sheni. And what's going to happen is it's going to regulate the temperature. So the walls are going to get hotter, the water is going to get cooler. And by the time, if you sort of graph it, by the time the cooking needs to happen, which is the raising of temperature in the substance I'm putting inside, and the time that the water is cooling down as a function of the heat exchange of the walls, it's not going to be long enough to cook. Right? That's what's generally understood. Okay, so this is cooling down too fast to cook whatever is in it. That's what's generally assumed. That's how Tosfos explains it. That being the case, you'd say, okay, so we're scot-free. Anything which is uncooked, let's put it straight into our kli sheni. Good? Not so simple, because the Mishnah tells us that there are certain things which makes a very intuitive sense. There are certain things which do cook in a kli sheni. They're what's called kalei habishol, things which are easy to cook. So the threshold of cooking them is much lower. So they'll be like the Gemara talks, or the Mishnah talks about what's called kulias haispanim, a type of Spanish mackerel, and talks about certain types of spices, which they were more well known in those days, that obviously have a very low threshold of cooking. If I have it in my boiling water, in my kli sheni, I have a problem. Right? So that's what the Gemara says, the Mishnah says as well. So you have to be so careful about certain substances. Now the question becomes, okay, so are those examples or they're the rule? That's the question that's asked in halacha. And there seems to be a number of examples of things which are not kalei habishol, clearly resilient substances which don't get cooked so easily. But in halacha, there's a big debate. And in the classic poskim, the Magen Avraham, as an example, tells us that we are concerned that many foods, unless we are sure that it is a resilient food, we are going to have to assume that it is a low threshold food, unfortunately, in halacha today. Which means to say is that although there are poskim who disagree with this, who don't view this, it's sort of like, we know a number of examples the Gemara talks about the things which don't cook so easily. We know a number of things the Gemara says do cook very easily. But most of the foods don't fall into those examples. So what do you do about the middle? What's about the middle ground? Where does that belong? So today the Magen Avraham says, because of a concern, we're not exactly sure what the threshold of cooking is for each different substance, we treat a kli sheni as bishul for most things, with the exceptions of the following. So the exceptions of resilient food are oil, water, cooked and cooled down liquids. Although generally speaking, when a liquid gets cooked and cooled down, we treat it like cooking again, but if in a kli sheni, we're not worried about it. And soluble solids. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. So the Chazon Ish disagrees. The Chazon Ish says in a kli sheni, we only deal with the really sensitive foods. There's a problem. Most things are fine. Don't be so negative about every food. But nonetheless, generally speaking, common practice today is not to put an uncooked food into a kli sheni for this reason as well. We treat the irui kli sheni, which is pouring from the kli sheni, as the same as a kli sheni, which leads us now to our third, and now we're going to actually reorient this now as our kli shlishi. So our kli rishon is our pot. Our kli sheni is our first vessel that comes, the water comes out into. Our kli shlishi is our cup that we're probably drinking from. Okay, that's what we're getting to on Shabbos. Where does that belong? This happens to be an interesting debate in the poskim. So, for instance, the Chazon Ish actually is machmer, and he says that our kli shlishi is the same as our kli shlishi is the same as our kli sheni for cooking. Now, from the Chazon Ish's perspective, that actually is helpful because he only believes that the kali abishul in the kli sheni is limited, much unlike the Magen Avram, where it is almost every food. So that's actually helpful. The Aruch HaShulchan says similarly that the kali abishul are a problem in a kli shlishi as well, anything which is easy to cook. But a well-known shuv of Rav Moshe Feinstein says that a kli shlishi is not mevashel, period. There is no such thing as cooking in a kli shlishi. That being the case, let's now go back to our to our starting point over here. So that being the case, with the general practice of the world today, is to say that a kli shlishi is not mevashel, even when it comes to regular substances, except for the ones that we know specifically are the kali abishul. Does that make sense? So let's just retrace the steps for a second. You put something which is raw into a kli rishon, that's cooking midaraisa. If you have a kli sheni, technically speaking, only the kali abishul are a problem, but because we extend the territory of what's called a kali abishul, most things, unless it's a resilient food, we don't put raw into a kli sheni. But when it gets to a kli shlishi, Rav Moshe Feinstein says there's no problem with anything in there, and the other poskim, like the Aruch HaShulchan, the Chazon Ish, say we are only concerned about things which are specifically like finely ground spices and so on. The specific examples of kali abishul, that's what should be concerned about. It's worthwhile noting that the Mishnah Berurah is machmir when it comes to a kli shlishi. So when the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Shin Yud Ches talks about making tea, the Mishnah Berurah does not say you should use a kli shlishi. What does the Mishnah Berurah say? You should use it in order to make tea, because tea is finely ground leaves which are raw, being placed in, being cooked, right? They're being cooked. So the Mishnah Berurah does not say place the tea leaves into kli shlishi. What does the Mishnah Berurah say the eitzah is? He says tea essence, which is, what is tea essence? Where I pre-cook it on Erev Shabbos in a liquid, so it's now highly concentrated taste of tea. I pour the tea essence into a kli shlishi. Why? Because it's already cooked water. So that's something which we would say is fine to put into a kli shlishi, but he would not allow putting a tea leaves into a regular kli shlishi. It's worthwhile knowing, if you are of a family that does tea essence, then you are more of the that stream of halacha is more machmir about a kli shlishi in general, and that would have impacts on our coffee discussion as well. Good. So this relates to grinds, instant, anything. This is the basics. Okay. So kli rishon, nothing raw can go into. Kli sheni, we generally practice that most raw things shouldn't go into it unless it is a resilient food. Kli shlishi, some people put anything raw into it, like Rav Moshe Feinstein. Some are machmir for specifically sensitive foods, and some are machmir across the board, like the Mishnah Berurah, not to put anything unless it's been already cooked into a kli shlishi. We good? And now let's go a little further. So let's try to get to instant. So you say, okay, well, what is instant precisely? Some people say it doesn't exist. It's not it's a fabrication of what really is. Instant essentially is just a convenience, if you think about what it is. Because real coffee, where you get real coffee from, is actually the coffee bean, which is ground up. Okay, the coffee bean in this, when you take a sniff of this, right, you'll never again be able to have instant, because if you have the real beans which have been ground up, which are raw, then it'll be very hard to go to instant. But the problem is like this: is that the granules are very hard to deal with. It's a process to make them, as we're going to go through in a moment. So it's much more convenient to have something which you don't have to do much more than pour and stir. So what this leads us to our instant. So what happens to our instant? But before we get there, just one, we'll do a quick moment to understand instant. What happens to the instant? Instant starts off as a regular bean, right? So it's a bean, it's ground up, and then it's brewed. But it's brewed in a highly concentrated fashion. And now you have a liquid of highly concentrated real coffee. But in order to send it to the masses, out on the shelves in the stores, what do? They need to convert that into something which we can just put into our tea, into our hot water, and boom, you have coffee as if it's the same thing. So what do? Say they dry it. They have to dry that substance, that highly concentrated brewed coffee and turn it into something which I, in my kitchen, on my counter, can just put into my coffee. So what do they do? There are two processes of drying. One is called spray drying and one is called freeze drying. What is spray drying? Is where they spray this liquid into a very hot at a very hot temperature. The water in the actual this brewed coffee evaporates, leaving behind granules of concentrated coffee, essentially, which is now the grains of instant coffee. Or freeze drying is where they actually take that liquid and they freeze it and then break it up into freeze it and then they dehydrate it at a high temperature and then remove the and then they break it up into little granules, or not granules, but actually little flakes, really, which turns into instant coffee. It's worthwhile knowing that OU notes that Nescafe is generally freeze dried, and when it comes to regular other coffees, it's usually spray dried. Just worthwhile noting the difference between that. So let's understand the process of what just happens to us to get to this point. So on the one hand, you say to yourself, well, that's great, because we know in halacha that there's a notion that I can't recook a food. So for instance, let's say I have my chicken, and I've made my schnitzel on Erev Shabbos, and it is fully cooked, ready to go. Beautiful. Fantastic. Am I allowed to put it on a heat source, that dry chicken? The answer is, if the heat source is covered, yes, you're allowed to put it on Shabbos, because there's no concern of cooking on Shabbos. There's another concern of shehiyah, which we'll get to in a moment. There's no concern of cooking per se on something which is already cooked. You cannot recook your schnitzel's a good example, not a roast for a second, but let's say my schnitzel, let's say whatever else is my cooked chicken, I cannot recook that. What about liquids? So when it comes to liquids, there happens to be a debate in halacha between the Ashkenazim and the Sfardim. The Ashkenazim, the Ramah tells us that when it comes to liquids, if I cook my liquid and then it cools down, so let's say I have soup. I have hot soup from Erev Shabbos, and now the soup cools down overnight, but I want to serve soup again. It's a cold winter's day. I want to have soup for lunch. I cannot reheat it on Shabbos, because now that it is cooled down, it has lost the effect of the bishul, essentially, and putting that cold or that room temperature liquid back and recooking it is a problem. That's called bishul. Yesh bishul acha bishul b'davar lach when it comes to wet, but ein bishul acha bishul b'davar yavesh. Good. So now we say, well, let's come back to our coffee for a second. So we say, well, our coffee, our instant coffee, has been brewed already. That's why it's already good. So it's brewed is cooked. Water and substance cooked together, I've brewed it, which means nothing I do to it now should be a problem, correct? Well, that's true. The only complexity that exists over here is the process of freeze drying or spray drying. Because actually Rav Elyashiv says that in the process of spray drying, that's my Maxwell house, if I'm dealing with the spray drying, remember it's going through a very hot temperature. The liquid is being sprayed through a very hot temperature to evaporate the liquid. That may constitute what's called tzli. Right? That's hot baking not in the context of a liquid cooking something. That being the case, it may actually lead us to a situation where I have something which is roasted now. Maybe the last definition of it is as roasted. If the last definition is as roasted, now can you cook something after you roast it? And the answer is, the Shulchan Aruch says we should be machmir for that, which is why on Shabbos, generally speaking, one should be careful about putting bread, which is roasted, dry heat, roasted and baking is the same, afiyah and tzli is the same for this, putting that pieces of bread into my soup bowl, if my soup bowl certainly is a kli sheni, right? Because here I have a general category of food, which is going into something which is certainly yad soledes boy, it's certainly above 110. And now I'm taking something which was not cooked but was baked, putting it into, now they can be effective cooking after that. Rosh Hashanah says, that's true about bread, but it's not true about instant coffee, because instant coffee was cooked first. So you can't uncook it by roasting it. You can add an additional layer that makes it even better, but you can't remove the fact that it was cooked. So Rosh Hashanah paskins that, in fact, when it comes to our instant coffee, because it was cooked, there's no cooking again afterwards. The only other concern that exists, this is why there's a lot of theory that goes into the instant coffee before we get there. The last thing that's worthwhile knowing is instant coffee considered a solid? So you say, Rabbi, it's a solid, it's flakes, right? So the truth is, it's not so simple, because this is actually what's called a soluble solid, which means to say, this doesn't cook. This melts. This was liquid and will be liquid. Okay, it was just evaporated. So when it comes to something like this, as opposed to a chicken, my chicken does not melt when I put it into water, right? It does not. It is a substance which remains and will be cooked when it gets into another substance. This coffee was a liquid, and when it goes into a liquid, it will melt into the liquid again. In that situation, do we consider that a liquid or a solid? So although there are many poskim who say that that's considered a liquid, and therefore yesh bishul bishul acha bishul, but davar lach. Maybe there is a bishul after this when it comes to davar lach, even though it was already cooked, right? So I could treat this like my soup, which is cooled down essentially. Then in that respect, however, if you remember, let's go back to a few steps before. Oh, good question. There's different types of salt. Just remember, salt itself is a debate in halacha as to whether it's more resilient or it's completely unresilient. Well, that's a debate that's had. But there's another piece about salt. It depends if it's mine salt or if it's sea salt. Sea salt was boiled. Mine salt was not. So just to be aware of this. When you look at the side of your salt, you'll just see where it is. Is it Dead Sea salt that was boiled, right? So it wasn't mined. When you go to Polish salt was mined from the mines down by Warsaw. Okay, just to be aware of the other types of salt. Now, so you say, I'm just trying to eat, Rabbi, I'm just trying to eat. Okay, but now, so now, when it comes to this, you'll remember that let's go back to this, and now we can finally get to something practical, because this is all theory, but it's important theory, right? So now we say like this. So let's say, so if you remember, we have our kli sheni. Our kli rishon is cooks anything raw. Our kli sheni cooks anything raw, which is sensitive. We're concerned about most foods which are sensitive, except they're resilient. But our kli shlishi, we say, is not going to cook. Right, and in fact, even a kli sheni doesn't cook things. What were the exceptions? Water, oil, and the other one thing was liquid, which is cooled down. Which means, in a kli sheni, even if we consider this liquid that cooled down, and you say, oh, well, this is called a liquid, and yesh bishul acha bishul by davar lach, by a liquid, well, that's not a problem by a kli sheni. So therefore, at this point in time, what was that? Certainly not in kli shlishi, and even in a kli sheni, for all intents and purposes. So now that we've reached this point, now we can say, okay, now let's take. It looks like our water's just boiled here in a nice Shabbos urn. Okay, so we're gonna take this is my kli sheni essentially. Okay, so now we have our first available coffee mixture over here, and so we have it. We have a nice hot water. This is just boiled as we were speaking. And now if I take my instant, this is my instant, which is already cooked. Arguably also roasted, but let's say cooked, right? So now I can put this in as I mix it in to my hot water, which is certainly more than 110 degrees. It's now all gone, right? It smells great. By the way, instant does not have a smell. They add smell to it to make it smell like real coffee. Yes. Okay, so which is why it goes away at the bottom of the container. It always smells best when you open the container, unlike real coffee, which always smells because it's real. Okay, but let's do this for a moment. So now I have my first cup of coffee over here. Even in according to many poskim, a kli sheni, there are some poskim who say do it in a kli shlishi, but certainly there's less of a concern of instant in a kli sheni, because even if we consider liquid, we have our first cup over here. Can I ask somebody to give me some more cups if that's all right? Because we're going to make some more coffee now. Okay, so this is my first cup. Anybody's welcome to have our first round of instant. Don't worry, I'm not a coffee critic to do for that. Yes.
So if you want to do, so certainly you could do irui kli sheni with instant.
Certainly, yeah, absolutely. So if I were to put my coffee, my instant coffee flakes into my kli shlishi and I pour into it, we're all set.
The reason is that there is a significant taste difference between
for sure.
when you add the hot water to the coffee.
Precisely, if you come from England, you will know that it is parsnish to put the tea bag into the tea.
So
you pour the water onto the tea because that's the first, and that's precisely what Irui Kli Rishon is.
Irui Kli Sheni makes better coffee than putting it into
100%, which is the thing. Thank you so much, Andy. So, okay, there we go. Alish, yes.
Is there a problem about coloring the water?
Good question. So there is a question about coloring. Rav Moshe actually asked the following question. In his trivia, he says, wait a second. You're telling me that kli shlishi is not mavashal, but I put my tea bag into my kli shlishi and you see the color dispersing. So he says, yes, that actually isn't cooking. That's the extraction of taste just through absorption. Now, coloring when it comes to food is a question which has had many poskim say it seems to be the default position is no tzvia ba'oichavin. But that's when when the color doesn't matter to you. Meaning, let's say I'm using it and it matters to me that I want it to be a different color, then there's a concern. But in this case, you don't want it to be brown or red, or you're just having, so there's no concern in this regard. Okay, now folks, now we get to Oh, we're good now. Now we have a lot of that theory. Now we can start getting to the shilas of real coffee, not just instant coffee. Yes, Paul.
You have to put the instant coffee into the cup after you pour the hot water into your
Correct.
container?
Absolutely. Yeah. You could not put it there at the beginning because that would be you could say that there are poskim who are concerned about instant coffee. So to avoid that, some people in the kli shlishi or sort of put it into a kli sheni. Let's get into our into our grinds now for a second, okay? Actually, this is a kettle, so we're not using the kettle on Shabbos, but that's just can't do it. So now there's different ways of dealing with pour overs. So right over here, I want to thank David for bringing his pour over here. So we have a regular bowl, a brew basket for our grinds. There are different ways of doing this. So for instance, I used to also have a nice pour over, single cup pour over. So you could use you put the filter into the pour over, you place it on the cup, and you go from there. However, filters, and you have to keep replacing them. You keep forgetting where the filters are. So there are other options these days, and so you can get these reusable filters, which are fantastic. It's a very, very fine filter, which I use. So when I'm doing real coffee, and the coffee grinds do not go through this for the most part, and you put it over a cup. So let's talk about this for a moment. So let's say I'm dealing with real grinds. Let's get the real grinds out. So I hope that people can already smell it from where you are right now, because this is so good. This happens to be. I want to thank actually Jay Delitsky gave me from the Chosen Bean down in Florida. For those who are coffee critics. So the generally they say about a tablespoon, but it depends again on this is finely ground coffee. This is wonderful. So we put into our filter for a moment. Okay, so whether the filter is a chad pa'ami or not a chad pa'ami. So I have my coffee in here. So now this is at this point in time completely raw, right? This is a completely raw coffee, which means that if I were to put these granules of coffee into my kli rishon, that would be considered bishul midoraisa. We're not doing that. Nobody's that way. Although I will tell you, in the shul's machines, you'll be surprised what people have done. Okay, people have put the grains into the top of the machine. So that's not so good for the machine. Okay, so
Sometimes it's 5:50 in the morning.
Yeah, people are desperate too. I wouldn't put it past people chomping on the granules if they couldn't find the water. But nonetheless, okay. So let's say we have it over here. So now you say, okay, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll pour it. I need like Shalom just said a moment ago. There's a difference between the first pouring and then just the hot water, right? So let's say I pour it directly onto I pump out of my hot pot into my granules. Well, that's a problem, because that's irregularity, which is mevashel kadei klippa, which a very thin layer is cooked, and this is only a very thin layer because this is the granules are so fine, certainly when they're ground properly. So that's a real problem. So I say, okay, what about a kli sheni? So let's say I pump into my pot now, and I pump into my kli sheni, and now I want to put into my kli sheni, and now, so let's say I want to do a pour from my kli sheni into this. More complicated, because iri kli sheni itself is similar to kli sheni, and if it's mevashel, something which is raw, like these grinds, that's a little bit of a problem. But let's say I pour it into my kli shlishi. So now I have my kli shlishi and I have my hot water, and I take my hot water and pour it over here. According to most poskim, with the exception, let's say, of the Mishnah Berurah, who would say about the tea essence, which would be translatable to here, according to most poskim, once I'm at my kli shlishi and I'm pouring out from my kli shlishi, that's fine, right? Because now I'm essentially, if you think what's going on over here, I'm now using a iri kli shlishi, which is only mevashel. Well, according to Moshe, is not mevashel at all. According to the Aruch HaShulchan, is only mevashel, the sensitive kalei habishul. This is probably not going to be one of those instances. That's not in a tea leaves maybe, but coffee grinds not necessarily. That will be fine. So that will be the way that I'll be able to do this to avoid the question of bishul. Note that there are some poskim will just say, no, you can't. A kli shlishi is still mevashel. This could still be considered kalei habishul. Let's avoid it. Use instant, right? Because instant's already been cooked. But there are many poskim, and certainly Rav Moshe, one can rely on when it comes to this, when it comes to using a kli shlishi or kli shlishi. But this runs into a much more complicated shaila, and it's not a bishul shaila altogether. This is the shaila which is, to me, is so fascinating, which is the boirer shaila. Because here's the issue. We know on Shabbos that you are not allowed to separate the bad from the good, and you're certainly not allowed to do it with a kli, with a vessel. But look what's happening over here. Here I'm taking my bad and good, right? So I'm taking my granules. Now the granules are very good, but I don't want them in my coffee. So I don't want to be drinking coffee while the granules are floating around. I'm not a Turkish fan, right? So I'm trying to just have my coffee. So now I'm using a misanenes, whether it is a misanenes like this, where I'm using a sieve, which is my chad pa'ami filter, or whether I'm using my filter over here, which is my reusable filter, and I'm filtering out the granules. So isn't that the most clear case of borer? That being the case, I may be able to surmount the visual issue, but how could I possibly surmount the borer issue? That becomes the real issue.
You're not
So,
for that filter out the granules already filtered out.
so
You
here
just
we
take the
go.
water
So
out.
let's do a little bit of the research on this. So the Mishnah tells us in Shabbos. The Mishnah tells us in Shabbos that you are not allowed to take. Now the Mishnah in those days, coffee wasn't the thing. It was kind of discovered by the Ottomans. In fact, I once went to a coffee exhibit at the Peabody Museum in Yale. It was really a fantastic history of coffee. You know how they discovered coffee in the first place? Is they found that the goats were very jumpy around certain bushes, right? And so they said there must be something here. And originally the Ottomans had the trademark. They wouldn't allow anybody out of the kingdom. They would search them for beans. So nobody could replant them elsewhere and start producing. Very fascinating history for coffee. But be it as it may, so when it comes to, let me just retrace my train of thought. Yes, so the Gemara doesn't talk about coffee, the Gemara does talk about wine. So remember, alcohol is a very important thing in people's lives. And so in those days, let's say you were to make a barrel of wines. You take the grapes, you squash them up, you let them sit, and it's fermenting, and it ferments, and you leave it in the barrel, and you finished your process, and now you have wine. Good. So now you want to take a full advantage of everything that you've produced. So let's say I pour out the wine and I bottle it, right? So this barrel produces tens and tens of bottles, fantastic. And now at the bottom is the sediment. So, today's day and age, you just throw out the barrel and the sediment because we don't care about anything. But in those days, they actually cared about everything. And they took the sediment and they said, well, if we can use the sediment, it's obviously a highly concentrated wine, essentially. We can actually use this. And so they use that to create mead or grappa, whatever what they would do is they would pour over water in order to extract the concentrated taste of the wine. And now create a new substance, not as expensive as wine, but certainly quite as potent as wine. So that's what they would do. So the Mishnah tells us in Shabbos, on Kuf Lamed Zayin, that you're not allowed to take the wet sediment. So let's say you scrape the bottom of the barrel. You take the wet sediment and you put it into a filter, and you allow it to drip down. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. Why? That's a classic case of borer. I now have a mixture of sediment and liquid, and I'm putting it into a mesanenes, into a sieve. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. But, says the Mishnah, if the sediment was already on the filter, I'm allowed to pour water over it in order to get it. And this is Paskin Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Yud Tes. Tes. The Shulchan Aruch says you're allowed to place water over the sediment in a filter already. And the Mefarshim explain that it's when we talk about when it's dry, not wet, right? So we talk about where you're taking dry sediment of the grapes and pouring water over it. Why? Why is this not borer? So there's the way the Tosfos really explains it is that in the end of the day, Paul, you're relating to this, is in the end of the day, what goes in and what goes out is water. Right? So what goes in is water and what comes out is water. It's the same volume of water, in fact. The only difference is the water tastes different. It now tastes of the wine. So in that case, there was no borer. Perhaps framed a different way. The way I understood this mission just in its way of expressing it is, there was never a mixture. If that makes sense. There was never a mixture. If there's a mixture, now I'm not allowed to separate a mixture, but here, there was never a time to create a mixture because the water's coming in and it's going out at the same time, which means that there was never a time where there was bad and good mixed together. Now that I'm separating the good from the bad and taking it away with this.
It's not psolos mitoch either.
What was that?
It's not psolos mitoch.
Correct, exactly. So therefore, coming back to this, so let's do this. Do this. So in this case, the Shulchan Aruch says explicitly this is directly akin to coffee brewing, right? Directly akin to it. This is instead of taking the taste out of the wine dregs or sediment, it's now taking the taste out of the grinds, right? In this case, avoiding the bishul shaila for a second in terms of the borer shaila is no question. So let's do this together quickly for a second. So this is how I would do it. I have my kli rishon. I turn to my kli sheni. So let's say I put my kli sheni over here. So I'm using my air pump. I take my kli sheni. I now put my kli sheni into my kli shlishi. Okay, so here's my kli shlishi. Everybody's gasping, oh my gosh, so much heat exchange, and that's precisely the point. And now it just depends how you do this. You're supposed to, for the real connoisseurs, you have to preheat it, but we're not doing that right now. So you're supposed to go in a circular fashion, and you go around and around and around. This is brewing as we speak. Okay, so this is essentially what we have over here. Now it goes through. It takes a few seconds. It's now dripping through, and as you can probably smell, this is freshly brewed coffee on a single serve. It's not as good as if it would have been on a weekday when it would have been from a Kli Rishon. That's the point. You're not supposed to cook on Shabbos. I've now produced my first cup of freshly brewed coffee on Shabbos, avoiding the shilas of bishul and avoiding the shilas of boirer. Good. So this is important, which leads us now to the next situation, which is very important. So hang on first.
But I'm saying, but it's staying. I see it staying in the filter for some.
Good question. So the truth is that apparently that's not enough to take to create a mixture. That's according to my story. According to the Tosfos read, the Piskat read. In the end of the day, it's water in, water out. So that doesn't make a difference how long it stays in the middle. But clearly, in the wine, the same question would have existed. And the Mishnah still says it's a very Mishnah in Shabbos Kuf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, which says it's all right. And the Shulchan Aruch paskins it explicitly. So in our case, that's not boirer. That's just a fascinating application. So now you say, okay, let me show you a really cool machine. This is great. There's a few different iterations of this machine now. This is for the for people who just can't do instant, but they can't need to have something on Shabbos. So there's a few. This one's called Ignite. There's a Gourmet. There's a few versions of what this is. What do you do? So this machine is essentially a single serve K-cup option. What do you do? So you take a K-cup and you place it essentially. So I have my K-cup, which is what's inside a K-cup? Grinds. Now just be honest. This for a second. Is really properly brewed coffee needs time, right? But we don't have time. So K-cups are a faster version of brewing. But nonetheless, let's say I take my Pike Place roast, Starbucks, right? And I'll stick it in over here. Actually, we're going to start the other way around. We're going to do our Kirkland donut shop option, okay? And I'll explain to you why in a second. You place it in, you pop it in. Now it pierces, right? There's a blade at the top which pierces pierces it. I pierced it over here. Now let's go back to it. So let's think about our situation. It's essentially exactly the same thing as my brew, my single brew. Why? What's happening is I now have the possibility of a filter. Where's the filter in this case?
In the K-cup.
It's in the K-cup. That's how K-cups work. So the K-cup has a filter inside of it. It's surrounded by a filter. I have the granules in the K-cup. I'm pouring water in. Is it an issue of boirer? No. In the same way that a regular filter is not boirer. Is it bishul? Well, it depends how you do it. So let's do the right way. So again, we start with my kli sheni. So now I'm going from my kli rishon to my kli sheni. I go into my kli shlishi. Now, folks, we're not getting into the droplets in this kli shlishi for a second. Okay, that is an interesting discussion to be had. Okay, so let's say I'm moving into my kli shlishi. I now pour it into my gourmet. Okay, we do need a cup at the bottom, otherwise we're going to have problems. One of these things about coffee is you've got to know what's going on. Okay, there you go. So you pour it into over here, and now what you essentially do is you just do the same thing a Keurig would do, but by hand. So if you go in camp, now you'll those who appreciate the Keurig sound, that's just the right sound, isn't it? But it's mechanical. It's not. So now you just go all the way down. It's just sometimes it's we Pavlovian, from a Pavlovian perspective, we need the sound to make it right. Can you feel it? Just right. Yeah, we're gonna get to the end. You know that feeling at the end when you hear the cue. Yeah. Here we go. 1 second. Listen, folks. Listen. It's such a good feeling. Okay, good. Here we go. Yeah, the machine is just doing this for us every time. Okay. There we go. And now we have it. Now we have. Wait a second. So Robbie, we haven't got there yet. So now, by the way, here we have freshly brewed K-cup with the now avoiding boirer, avoiding bishul, because from a kli shlishi. Fantastic. But we've not avoided all the issues because remember I put in the donut shop, and the reason why I put in the donut shop is because if you take a look at the donut shop, it actually has us put the cup back over here for the extra drips because this is not like the Keurig. You'll notice that on the donut shop they have a circle in the center which is completely blank of any writing. But if I were to take my Pike's Place roast, there's writing in the center, which means as I pierce it, I've erased those letters, which is now another shine in Shabbos called moichek, and that's a real issue. So if I wanted to use my single serve K-cups, what I would need to do is either Use Donut Shop, Kirkland. Okay, we're going below our expertise here. or we would need to pre-pierce our K-cups in order to get there. So folks, this is not as simple as it always appears. One has to be careful about these kind of things. So that would be important to do, to pre-pierce. Now, I want you to tell a little secret about the gourmet. People don't know this, is that actually it stores the K-cups in it as well. So it's another little piece of advertising over here. But nonetheless, this would be this. So this is an extension essentially of the regular brew. However, the only difference when it comes to this, like timing, is the only difference is that when it comes to this is the piercing issue as well. So now let's get to say, well, folks, I don't do mechanical things. I do machines. Right, so you say, so let's say I do a machine over here, and I want to set up the machine. I'm going to get to French press in a second. So let's say I do a machine. This is a significant machine. Most people do not have something like this at home. This is for multiple serves. We have this in shul, and you're welcome to sponsor the coffee every week. Many people have it, and there are many brachas said. So it's a very kedai option. Now, what happens in this? So in this, I want to thank Dr. Huberfeld. So we have the same situation, just on a mass production level now. So I have my brew basket. So there's my brew basket. I have my filter. I have a lot of coffee over here. Smells very good. What you do is you put the filter in over here, so it belongs just underneath over here. And now let's say I'm going to pour this in. Now while this is brewing, so we're just going to have this brewing as we speak. Let's say I say like this. Well, this is we bring a real coffee now. This is going to be many serves for what we have over here, and this is fresh ground coffee. Now, obviously on Shabbos I couldn't do this. Why? Because this is my Kli Rishon, right? Which means to say that it's actually boiling. The water is hot as we speak. It's boiling the water inside here. There's already pre-boiled water. And it's putting that boiled water onto my brew. That is bishul midoraisa. So you say, I know that's a problem. So, but what happens if I'm so clever? I say, I'm going to attach my machine, even though it's a small machine, and I'm going to attach it to a timer. And I'm going to set it at 6:37 on Shabbos morning, as I'm just waking up for the hashkama. And I need that extra kick. Right? And I have my cup underneath. I have everything set up, and the timer's going to go on, and it's going to brew my coffee. I'll be there. As I walk down the stairs at 6:45, there will be my cup of coffee waiting for me. What about that? So let's go through the questions. You say, okay, we have a little bit of a problem here, because what's inside here? What do we just put in here? This is fresh. These are granules which are not cooked, right? So what do I do in that situation? So this enters into an important shayla, which is what's called the issue of, well, there's three issues. Issue number one is shehiyah, other one is timers, other one is avshamilsa. Let's go through this quickly. When it comes to shehiyah, I'm not allowed to do the following situation. Let's say I have an uncooked schnitzel, and it's rushing, and I'm getting back, and it's a winter Shabbos, and I flip my schnitzel into my oven on Erev Shabbos, or onto a grill on Erev Shabbos, and I leave it. I'm not cooking. I started on Erev Shabbos. Is that all right? So that's not bishul. That, because technically speaking, you're not mevashel on Shabbos. You didn't put it on Shabbos. You put it on Erev Shabbos. That's an issur d'Rabbanan, what's called shehiyah. Shehiyah is you're not allowed to leave something which is not cooked on Erev Shabbos going into Shabbos. And the concern, says the Mishnah, is because shema yachate begecholim. What's going to happen? Is the guests are coming. The Friday night meal is happening. You're going to start just moving around the coals to hasten it, which is bishul. So shehiyah is an extension of the concern of bishul. So it has to be as uncooked. Once it's already halfway cooked, then we're all right. But what if the schnitzel is less than half cooked? You're not allowed to put it onto the fire before Shabbos because of shehiyah, because the concern of shema yachad begecholim. So you say, what does that have to do with us? Here's how it has to do with us. Let's say that now I put my food on the stove, but the stove is not on Shabbos, but the stove is going to go on Shabbos, right? So let's say I have a food which is going to go on. So what's the example? So the Shulchan Aruch talks about this example. It says, let's say I have an already cooked food, and I put it onto my radiator or near my and I say to the non-Jew, please switch on the heat. Am I allowed to say to you, please switch on the heat during the winter? The answer is yes, you are, because we paskin I call cholim etzel atzina. Everybody is considered sick when it comes to the cold. I can say, please, can you switch on the heat? But now I can also ask them to put the pot on this cooked substance on the radiator beforehand, even though it's going to warm it up now. Why? Because there's no bishul and it was placed there beforehand, right? Why is there no bishul? Because it was already cooked. But So the discussion is can a Jew place it there? The Ramah says no, a Jew cannot place it there on Shabbos because that's considered being a part of the process. It's like saying, I'll just put the pot on the stove and I'll ask the non-Jew to heat it, to switch it on. That's considered cooking. That's part of the cooking process because I'm echad maybe a sa'ur, echad maybe a sa'etzim, and so on. But now, what about me putting it on Erev Shabbos? Can a Jew put that pot on the radiator before Shabbos, knowing that on Shabbos morning I'm going to say to the non-Jew, please switch it on, right? That's a question which is had, and the question becomes is if it's already cooked, then many other points can say no problem because there's no shema yachat v'gecholim, there's no concern of you stoking those coals. You know why? Because it's already cooked. But if it's uncooked, I return to a shehiyah problem on Shabbos itself, not going from Erev Shabbos to Shabbos. Why? What's going to happen? Let's say I put on Erev Shabbos my uncooked substance on something which is going to switch on Shabbos. Let's say on a mutter way. So let's say it's going to switch on in a mutter way. I'm telling the non-Jew because of the cold. Or a timer maybe, right? So now it switches on Shabbos morning. But if it's uncooked, I might have the concern of Shemiyah Gachat V'Cholim. I'm going to adjust it to speed it up. So if that's the case, I have a problem of Shehiyah. So you say, well, that's fine because you can't really speed up the process. Oh, but you can. Because even on my wonderful Eurotech Jewish product over here, you'll notice that at the very top there's a button which is called reboil, which means to say that these pots are not so good, let's be honest, right? They keep it at a steady temperature. That steady temperature is not the temperature we would have our tea or our coffee on a weekday. So there might be an issue of clicking the reboil, or depending on what your coffee machine looks like, you have to discuss this. So this coffee machine is fantastic in this respect because you'll notice there are no buttons. There's no adjustment. There's no degree of roast. There's no degree of temperature. You cannot change anything. It has simply a plug. I plug it in and it's on. If the water's going through, it's brewing. There's no, and therefore, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, in this case, there's an on and off switch. That's not Shemiyah Chate. Shemiyah Chate is adjusting, not switching on and off. So that means to say that if you have a coffee brewer which has no adjustment, no temperature, length, roast level, if I have no buttons on it, then you might consider that, as Rav Moshe Feinstein does, not a concern because that's what's called kotum. That means to say that the coals are covered, I can't adjust it, essentially. However, there are poskim or machmir. So Shmir Shabbos Kilchos says, this is how I brew coffee. That's how I cook it in the weekday. That's going to be a problem, even if I cover the dials, if there's no dials accessible to me. That's the way you do it, as opposed to, let's say, a hot tray. A hot tray, no one cooks on a hot tray. A hot tray isn't made for cooking. That's considered kotum. That's considered not adjustable if there's no switches on it, it's just a plug-in, like this would be. But when it comes to this, Rosh Shlomo Zalman and the Shmir Shabbos Kilchos are machmir on this. So on that account, more complicated. You say, what about timers? Let's move to the next thing. Is a timer akin to a loud way to switching something on Shabbos? And the answer is, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, absolutely not. You're allowed to use it for lights because that's what people already do. This for no other thing can a person use a timer on Shabbos. Otherwise, this is a disgrace to Shabbos. If the Chazal were around today and they heard about timers, they would make it asr as part of muktzah, right? Right as well. So he said nothing else is allowed at all. Generally speaking, the minhag ha'olam is generally to be a little more makil. So, for instance, what are other things that people do use timers for every Shabbos? Air conditioning. Every air conditioning unit comes with a thermostat. The thermostat is 4 quadrants of the day, and people do set that. Sometimes at night time it'll go off, so it'll adjust the temperatures. So people do use timers when it comes to ACs, and then it gets into more of a, we'll call it slippery slope area. What about my dishwasher? What about other kinds of things that people do? There are poskim are very, very conservative and say Rav Moshe said we shouldn't be doing it because otherwise this is going to be my TV on a timer and everything, and then it becomes a whole thing. This is not the way that Shabbos should look like. On the other hand, there are poskim who say for things which are clear that you did not do. You didn't switch them on, and this is the way of the world, that would be all right. So it's interesting. I just want to make an interesting point over here. The person who's makil when it comes to viewing a coffee machine that without a dial on it as being kotum and not a problem of shehiyah is Rav Moshe. But the one who says that the timers are a problem is Rav Moshe. So I just want to point out that for intellectual honesty, we have a little bit of a problem over here for those people who care about that. So it doesn't come out on the same side of the fence. But be it as it may, the last piece over here, which is worthwhile knowing, is what's called a notion of av shamilsus. The Gemara talks about in Shabbos Daf Yuches Aleph, where a person puts wheat into a grindstone. The grindstone is propelled by a watermill. and so I do this on Erev Shabbos. Am I allowed to leave it on this? This is not a case of bishul, so there's no shemi yachate begecholim because that's precise, that's specific to bishul. In this case, it's really what's happening. What's the melacha that's happening? Is toichen. It's grinding. But the toichen is automated. Why? Because the water is going to carry on going. When I was growing up, we used to go to Cape Town for vacation, and the apartment building that we had an apartment in was called Albion Mill because it faced an old mill, water mill. So every morning we'd hear the mill turning, based on the river would make it go round. So let's say you put your wheat into that mill and it's going over Shabbos. So the Gemara debates as to whether this is allowed or not. Two opinions of the Amoraim. The Shulchan Aruch paskins. It's fine. It's not a problem because you didn't do it on Shabbos. There's no shvisas kalim issue. Your kalim don't need to rest. Your behem is not moving it because that would be a shvisas behemtai issue. It's all right. The Ramah says, yeah, but we are machmir. So the Ashkenazim are machmir for a case of automating this on Erev Shabbos. And this is a b'makom hefsed. If it is avsha milsa, let me tell you something. Water mills are loud. You can hear it blocks and blocks away. You can hear it moving and turning. That would be if I set something in motion on Erev Shabbos, which is audible to everybody else. That's a problem. The question is, what about a coffee machine? So let's say I paskin that timers are all right on a Shabbos, which many poskim would do for basic activities, right? And let's say I have a coffee machine which does not have any adjustable dials. Right, so it's cotton, so there's no issues of Shia. Let's say the timers are all right in this case. The question is well, but it's like, is there a concern of avsha milsa? So generally speaking, the way that this is a sensitive discussion in the top on this topic. Generally speaking, one of the rules of thumb is if you can't hear in the next room, the adjacent room, that's not considered avsha milsa. That's not. So many poskim would say there's no concern of avsha milsa. That on that account, the coffee machine is not an issue. Remember, folks, let's just go back on this quickly. When it comes to my coffee machine, it's taking raw grinds. It's in a kli rishon. It's doing the real deal. I can't put a kli shlishi and a kli shlishi when it comes to this. So now I'm having an activity which is going on. Is it a problem if it's set on a timer? Well, if timers are right, then it's fine. But if there's a concern, or if there's a possibility of adjusting my machine, the issue of Shia exists on a Shabbos morning as much as it exists on a Shabbos night, and that would be a problem. So one has to be very careful when it comes to this to set up the right equipment. Let's go a little weiter because I have one or two more things which are really important to address, if that's all right. I know we're a little late, but I think it's really important to finish up and do this properly. We have two more instances that are important to discuss. The number one is a French press. So how does a French press work? Oh, we should have set this all up before. So we should have done this all before. So the French press is essentially I take my boiled water, right, and now I also place my grinds in the boiled water. So let's say I put let's say I'm doing this on Shabbos. And let's say I put a kli sheni in between. Okay, so I'm skipping my kli sheni here. So I put my hot water into my kli sheni. I put my kli sheni into here, and it says this is my kli shlishi. Good. Now I take my grinds. So I'm going to take my grinds there. Now again, it depends. I'm not using the exact measurements of my hand. I'm using very precious material here, so I just want you to know. Okay, so now let's I put this all together, and let's avoid the mixing up. But let's say I'm just doing this for the sake of. So now what happens is I let this settle, right? So I let this settle and I give it a few minutes. And French press is really much more of an authentic way of brewing coffee than would be a filter because it's taking time. So now the question becomes like this: is there bishul if it's in a kli shlishi according to many poskim? Not. Again, the Mishnah Berurah would say there is bishul because it's raw grains. Now the question becomes: thank you so much. Paul is one of our dedicated coffee makers, as is Shalom. So now the question is what about this? So when it comes to this, this becomes an issue of boirer. This because now, if you'll notice, if I start pushing down the press, what happens is it essentially is a filter, right? And what I'm doing is I'm pushing the grain to the bottom because I don't want to drink my grains. And as doing so, I'm removing the psoiles. I'm removing the unwanted chaff in this case, which is the grinds. In that case, that is considered boirer. However, you say, but that's not how I have my French press. French press is an experience, right? What happens is that I put it into my water, I let it sit, I give it a few minutes to absorb, to steep in the taste. And then I come back in 10 minutes' time. By the time I come back in 10 minutes' time, guess what? The granules have already dropped to the bottom. So in that case, is it all right? So this is talked about in halacha. The KOR in Rabbi Heber in Toronto has an article on this topic. And the truth is that if, let's say, it's all at the bottom, all the granules at the bottom, and I push down my my plunger, or my all the way to about 3/4 of the way, what the water that I'm pushing my plunger through, or the sieve through, at the top, has no granules in it. That makes sense? It's already sunk. So that's not an issue of borrow. That water I'm not sifting. The moment I get close to the bottom, I have a problem. For a practical level and a halachic level. A practical level is I'm probably just going to push it too far. You have to be very careful, because you get all the way to the bottom and you've essentially finished doing a borrow process, right? But also, but halachically as well, is if there are still 1 or 2 granules that are floating and you're pushing them down, you still borrow those from the water. So one has to be very careful. If it's really settled, there's a lot of water, and you're pushing it down, and you're clearly going to above the levels of where the settled granules, then it's fine. My pouring is not doing that. Is not doing the sifting. That's already happened. I'm allowed to have my French press. Therefore, I'll be able to take my freshly brewed coffee over here and make what for our purposes now is essentially my 4th cup of coffee. Okay, so we're all having a very good day today. Okay, now the last thing over here, by the way, you can see this did not steep long enough. You can see it's very light in taste because we did not do it as it should be, but this was done as such. That comes to our level of French press. The last issue we're going to deal with is the notion of via instant. You say, well, via instant is just another way for Starbucks to get more money. Yes, it is true, and they are ridiculously expensive at $1 a pop. But I don't have one over here. You know the little via sleeves? There's the purple ones and the green ones. And it's essentially a one serve option. So you take it, you rip over the top, and you put it in. So you say, okay, well, isn't that just the same as instant? The answer is not precisely. The reason is because we all know that instant is not the same as freshly brewed coffee, and Starbucks knows this as well. So what do? They said, we got a hack for you. What we'll do is we'll place a certain amount of finely ground, real granules of coffee into my instant, thereby giving it a real smell and a real kick to it. So therefore, it is a combination of instant and freshly brewed. This becomes an interesting discussion, because now the percentages are that in a via instant you will have 97% is instant, and 3% will be the finely ground granules of raw coffee granules as well. So you say, well, what do you do in this situation? So the question becomes what do you do when you have a mixture as such? Do you say there is bittul in such a mixture? Complicated shaila, because here the bittul is not something which is asr. The bittul is one substance to another which actually taste very similar to each other. So the Pri Megadim talks about this the following situation. Let's say I have a piece of meat which has got gravy on it, and the piece of meat has already been cooked, and so is the gravy. Can I put that piece onto a substance which is hot, or leave it on something which is hot on Shabbos? Is it a problem of bishul? So you say, well, when it comes to the solid, no problem, right? Why? Because ein bishul acha bishul b'davar yavesh, by a solid substance. But when it comes to the gravy on it, the gravy is a liquid. Even if the gravy is pre-cooked, yesh bishul acha bishul on the gravy. Says the Pri Megadim, no problem, because what's the most of the substance that we're dealing with here is a solid. Yes, you have a few drops of gravy, irrelevant, because the main substance over here is the meat, which is solid. So you say the same svara applies to over here. The main substance over here is instant coffee. The secondary substance is the grinds, with the fine grinds. Do you say there's a bit in a similar situation? Happens to be, Rav Moshe says you should only use this Pri Megadim in a situation of Shas Dechak. Now it depends how much your family tell you are in an uncaffeinated situation. But the problem is the Shas Dechak. But the truth is you could probably survive on instant, which makes it a little more complicated to do this. But let's say it's the worst of the worst. Let's say that the via is the worst. Let's say we say there's no bittul and there's grinds. Well, you're just back to square one, which is if it's going to be my kli rishon, bishul. If it's my kli sheni, then there's yes, for kale bishul, we perhaps we put into that category, there will be a problem. But if it's my kli shlishi, and I paskin like Rav Moshe in general, and I'm not a tea essence person, and I'm alright to put the coffee into kli shlishi, or like this, or irui kli shlishi like the net, then there's no problem as well. Just one has to be more careful with a via instant than a regular instant. Regular instant could possibly go into a kli sheni, not at the bottom, not pouring from a kli rishon, but into the kli sheni which is already poured. Whereas via instant would have to go into a kli shlishi, which has already been in order to facilitate this. Okay, so Rabbi says. So I hope this has given a sufficient background to a very fascinating, complicated, and delicious smelling topic.